Okay, this is Rufina Baca. It is April 8th, 2021. I am here with Marge Taniwaki over a Zoom call. We are doing an oral history project for our History and Chicano Studies 491 class with Colorado State University Pueblo. She is located in Denver. And Marge, can I ask you to introduce yourself and do you give us permission to record this?
I'm Marge Taniwaki in Denver, Colorado, and you have my permission to record this session.
You were only 7 months when your parents were forced to leave everything they owned behind and live as prisoners, but your family did not commit any crime. What do you remember as a child living at Manzanar?
The most vivid thing that I remember is always waking up in the morning with grit in my mouth, and that was because there were daily sandstorms in the desert of Manzanar, and the barracks that we lived in were very flimsy. They were built with low-grade lumber that had lots of knot holes in them. They were also built with wood that hadn't been seasoned, so they shrank in the desert heat and left gaps in the floorboards and in the walls, so the sand would blow into the barracks, and it didn't matter how much we swept and mopped and cleaned. It was always dusty inside. And so especially in the mornings when I would wake up, I would always cover my mouth and nose with the army blankets that we were given to cover ourselves. And this is kind of a funny story, but when I pulled the blanket down from my mouth and nose, I would always have a band of dirt across my eyes and my forehead. And my older brother and sister, who were 5 and 7, would call me Tanuki, which in Japanese it means badger. You know, the badgers have like a black mask across um, their eyes, and so that was one of my nicknames in the camp. And of course, I remember the heat of the desert. We would always have to stand in line at the mess hall in order to eat, and it would get to 115 or more degrees out in the sun while we were waiting for our turn to go inside the mess hall to eat. So um, when all of us were told that we had to, we were going to be forcibly removed from our homes, um, we didn't know where we were going or how long we would have to stay, and some people had as little as 48 hours to um, get ready to go. And so if you had a business or a farm, it was really hard to try and take care of your farm animals. And if you had crops in the ground, you had to, there was no way to harvest them in time. And so it was a really difficult decision, like what to take, especially since we didn't know where we were going, and if we were going to be sent to some place where it was really cold, which was the case in like Wyoming, where it could get to 20 degrees below zero during the winters. Nobody along the West Coast, which has relatively mild weather, no one had the kind of clothing that was, would protect us from the cold. I'll tell you another uh, story. This is about my grandfather, who was arrested on December 7th. So that means the United States government already had lists of people compiled that they were going to arrest. Otherwise, how would the FBI know where to go to pick up people like my grandfather? And of course, none of us had done anything wrong. We had never committed a crime. We were not spies or saboteurs. But anyway, the FBI came and picked up my grandfather and took him to a place in Montana where they were severely, interrogated. And my grandfather's best friend was arrested at the same time, and he actually committed suicide in that particular prison because the interrogation was so harsh, and he just gave up hope. And the U.S. government took just about anybody. They even took Buddhist priests or people who taught judo. There seemed to be no real rhyme or reason for taking the people that they did. So I don't really believe that Pearl Harbor was a sneak attack. Another piece of information is that there were 2 air carriers that were stationed at Pearl Harbor, and both of those air carriers, which so planes were able to land on those carriers, and they were both out of port. In other words, they were away from their harbor and out on the open seas. And of course, those air carriers played a huge part in the victories of the U.S. And it was only the small battleships that were still in port at Pearl Harbor that were sunk by the Japanese plane. So I think it's always important to know as much as you can about the history leading up to the war and how the U.S. had denied oil shipments getting to Japan and other issues as well. But getting back to the prison camp itself, it was a mile square and had held about 10,000 inmates altogether. So it was very crowded, and it was built on a block system. So there were, I think, 24 barracks per block, and right in the middle of each block were the mess hall, which and all of the names of the places, and barracks and so on. They're all military names because the camps were built to military specifications, and the type of construction was built for occupancy by hardened soldiers for only a period of 6 months. So they were very flimsy, and yet we lived in them for almost 4 years. So it was very poor grade lumber, almost like particle board. It was not always solid lumber, and covered by tar paper. So there was no real insulation. So it became, and the tar paper was black, and so it soaked in the sun. So the interior of the barracks were very, very hot during the desert summers, but it was also equally cold during the winters, especially because the lumber had shrunk and there were gaps in the floor, and then all of the knot holes had fallen out, and of course that allowed all of the snakes and scorpions and other things to come up through the floorboards, including the dirt that would always end up in my mouth overnight. The health care was also very poor. There wasn't an actual hospital where they took people who were sick. Was to a barracks that was converted, with beds, and the doctor that they had was actually one of the inmates who had a medical practice on the outside. He took care of the patients as best that he could with what few medications and equipment that he had. one of the women at Manzanar died in childbirth. She had twins, and both of her babies died as well. And there's a picture of her funeral, and it looks like there are lots of wreaths with flowers, but there were no flowers at Manzanar. And what the inmates did was they made flowers out of paper, and you can see this picture of the funeral. You can see the Sierra Nevada mountains in the background. So we were very close to the Sierra Nevadas, and it's getting towards Northern California, but it's in inland in California, and that's where all of the water for the state of California, or much of the water, comes from. And Manzanar, which means apple orchard in Spanish, back at the turn in the early 1900s, it actually was an apple orchard, and it was a agricultural area, and they also grew pears and other things like that. But there were rich men who convinced the farmers in the area that the water was drying up, and they bought the land at fire sale prices, and then they built an aqueduct that funneled all of the water from the Sierra Nevadas down to Los Angeles, and that's why LA is able to, became the metropolis that it is today. And there's an old film called Chinatown that you can probably find on the network, and it tells that whole story of how the farmers were duped into selling their land, and then how all of the water was diverted, and why the area called Manzanar became a desert. And today there are issues around the fact that a lot of the area have become wind farms, and the wind blows all of the time there. And there used to be, before all of the water was diverted from that area, there was a place called Owens Lake. Manzanar has an area called Owens Valley. And anyway, all of the water evaporated, and now all of the alkaline that's at the bottom of the lake gets blown by the wind. And the people who live in the area now, which was originally Paiute land, suffer from lung diseases because they breathe in the alkaline dust that is blown by the wind, which would never have been a problem if the water were still in that area. So the 10 major camps that the Japanese Americans were put into are located in some of the most desolate areas of the United States, and that includes Amache here in southeastern Colorado. It's near Lamar, so actually not. I guess it's a couple of hours away from Pueblo to the east of where you are. It's on Highway 50, and since the 1970s, I've worked on preservation and restoration of that particular prison. And Amache is now under consideration to become a national park and become a part of the national park system. So I hope some of you will take an interest in that and maybe follow the progress of it becoming a national park. And those of us of Japanese descent, and actually people who live around the town of Granada, Colorado, which is only about a mile away from Amache, have tried to keep up the camp and restore it. And we've brought back barracks and original barracks and brought it back to the site. We've rebuilt a guard tower and the water tank that serviced both the prison camp and the town of Granada back in the 1940s and 50s, and maybe even into the 60s. I did have an uncle who, but he lived with me at Manzanar. He was about 20 years older than me, and he volunteered into the U.S. military. Now, mind you, this is an important point. The Here we were behind barbed wire, right? Prisoners in our own country, and our young men were actually drafted into the U.S. military. Can you believe that? It's a sore point. If we were spies and saboteurs, how come you want to, draft our young men to join the U.S. military? But anyway,
Yeah.
um, so my uncle, his name is Kosaku Yamada. Um, he was assigned to what was called the Military Intelligence Service. He was fully bilingual in Japanese and English. So what the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, was assigned to do was to interrogate Japanese prisoners and also to translate captured documents, so maps and other documents, so that the U.S. would know what the Japanese military was, what their next move was going to be. My uncle also, Kosaku, also went on to serve in the occupation forces in Japan after the war ended. And he would come back to visit, but he never ended up coming back to the U.S., where he was born in L.A. and was no, I guess he was still a teenager when he went to Manzanar. So I think some of your students there are probably around that same age. So just imagine making those kinds of decisions at that age, where that you've been accused by the U.S. government of being a spy or a saboteur, and yet you've been drafted into the U.S. military, and then you're being patriotic and you're doing all of these things to help the U.S. win the war. It becomes a very a difficult situation to be in. We also had young men who we call resistors. And these are young men who said not that they wouldn't fight, but they wanted their constitutional rights returned to them before they joined the U.S. military. So they said, let us out of prison, um, restore our rights as U.S. citizens, and then we'll join the U.S. military. Instead, they were put on trial by the U.S. government. The most famous trial was at Heart Mountain in Wyoming. It's near Yellowstone, and that's where it can get to 20, 30 degrees below zero. And they were convicted of draft evasion, and they were sent to Leavenworth, which is a federal facility, sentenced to 2 years at hard labor. They were pardoned later by President Truman, but it set up a dynamic within the Japanese community because they're who had volunteered or joined or been drafted into the U.S. military, including a unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. That is it's the most highly decorated unit in U.S. military history. So they have more Purple Hearts, more Congressional Medals of Honor, on and on and on. But what those Japanese Americans were fighting for was to prove their loyalty. I don't think that they should have had to shed their own blood to, prove their loyalty. And again and again, they were commanded by a white general who hated their guts. And so this general would send them into the worst areas of battle that he could, the most dangerous. And that's why they had so many casualties and earned so many Purple Hearts and so many medals. And to me, that it's just another exploitation that the United States government has done over and over again to us and to other people of color all throughout the U.S.'s history. So, I know that you're studying about the Japanese American internment, but I think it's important to also look into issues such as the child separation of mostly Central American children from their parents on the southern border here. It reminded us so much of our own experience that there are many of us Japanese Americans who are working with a group called Tsuru for Solidarity. Tsuru is means crane in Japanese, and you might be familiar with the origami, paper cranes that are folded and connected to. It's a like a fairy tale, I guess, in a way, in Japan. So the myth is that if you fold 1,000 cranes, you'll get your wish. And the most famous story is about a little girl named Sadako who was injured in the bombing of Hiroshima back in 1945. And she contracted leukemia. And so she started folding the 1,000 paper cranes so she could wish for recovering her health. But she died before she was able to finish the 1,000 cranes. So her classmates finished folding the paper cranes, and there's a statue of her, of Sadako, at Hiroshima, which I've seen. I traveled to Japan back in 2006, and Hiroshima was one of the places where I stopped to pay my respects. So because of our experience being incarcerated and enduring family separations and so on, we work to try to end that unjust separation of the children from their families, and to end ICE, and to close the prisons that are holding these mostly Central American children, and getting their families reunified, and to also advocate for more just immigration policies. You were thinking of there were military resistors from Amache, but there were also those who volunteered to join the U.S. military from Amache, and also it includes one Medal of Honor winner, and his name is on a monument that's located at the original cemetery at the prison camp at Amache. So the 10 camps stretched all the way. There were camps as far east as in Arkansas, and the 2 camps in Arkansas were located in a swamp. And the U.S. government brought government officials to come and look at us, and think that to make them think that we were being treated well. And so since they didn't want to take the government officials to a swamp in Arkansas, they had them visit Granada, the Amache. And so at Amache, the prison camp itself had a very different relationship than the other 9 major prison camps. They were inmates at Amache were often given passes to shop in nearby towns like Lamar. Lamar is about 17 miles away from Amache, And they would also go into the town of Granada, where there was actually a store that sold fish that was run by one of the inmates who was in Amache. And the townspeople from Grenada would often, let's see, so at Amache they would have, I don't know if you would call them festivals exactly, but different programs and things. And the townspeople at Grenada would actually come and join them. Uh, they played baseball games between the high school kids at Grenada and the teams from Amache. Not as harsh as some of the other camps. There was a high school that was built at Amache for the inmates, and there were complete. If you read some of the newspapers from back in the 1940s, there were complaints by the citizens of Colorado complaining that the inmates at Amache were being treated better than the people, the white people living in Colorado, and they claimed that the people there at Amache had better food and so on. Which I don't think is actually true. The one thing that I do know is the children at Amache were able to have milk all of the time. At Manzanar, where I was in prison, uh, the camp official stopped giving milk to children after the age of 2. So I only got milk for a little while when I was there, and then there wasn't any more. So um, I I have a lot of health problems from the lack of calcium. And in talking to other former inmates, we all share many of the same kinds of health problems. For instance, I have very bowed legs because of lack of calcium, and we all have had problems with our teeth, because calcium is so important in the growth of your teeth. And since we didn't have that calcium, a lot of us have had, major dental problems all of our lives. My father served as a fireman at Manzanar, and he made just $16 a month. And with some of that money, he would go to what they called a canteen, and he would buy cans of evaporated milk, and he would dilute it with water, and then have me and my older brother and sister drink that, trying to give us the calcium that we were no longer getting from the government rations.
So you were only 4 when you were in the camp, so you probably weren't in school yet, but did they have schools there at Mount Zanor?
They did have schools, and I actually attended a nursery school at Manzanar. And what I remember about that is they mostly had us take naps. They didn't, because there was at the beginning anyway, there was no real teaching system or educational system in the prison camps, and so that's mostly what I remember is we always had to lie down and take a nap. My older brother and sister did attend school, but at the beginning, and again, the schools were not really schools; they were just barracks that had been made into makeshift school classrooms. And at first, there were no desks or chairs or anything like that, no books, no paper. So, and what happened was mostly women who had been teachers on the outside began to organize and to create classes. And all of the furniture we had to make ourselves. So because when we first got to the barracks, there was nothing inside except for usually a coal burning stove, and one light fixture up at the up in the ceiling. And there were no electrical outlets or anything like that. So it was we had to make our own furniture out of scrap lumber that had been left over from building the barracks, and so we would just make rudimentary, tables and chairs. And uh, back then, fruits and vegetables used to come in wooden boxes. So apples would come in these apple crates, and we would turn them on end and use those to sit on, like a makeshift chair. And oranges came in a very long crate, and it had a partition in the middle. So if you turned it on end, it would be like a shelf, and you could put a board, across two upended orange boxes, and make kind of, like a shelf with, with some space to put. Were able to bring with us.
I read, or I don't know if I heard it, but they said they made makeshift like keyboards out of paper.
Yes.
They're to type in school.
So there were no typewriters, of course, to learn how to type. So the teachers would take a scrap of paper or cardboard or anything like that, and they would draw the keys on the cardboard, and then the children would practice typing, just by hitting the fake keys. And then later on, people would order things through the Sears Roebuck catalog and buy books and things like that, and so things got a little better, but it wasn't until later on.
And you mentioned that you had never seen like a swing set until you saw it in the Sears catalog.
Right. So with like I said, my father and $16 a month, and so we could order a few things. And back then, this was in the 1940s, early 1940s, and almost everybody across the United States would order things from a Sears Roebuck catalog, and those catalogs were about the size of the old telephone books. And that used to be my dream world, because I would see things in it that I had never seen, having arrived in camp when I was 7 months old. So I would look through the catalog almost every day, and the pages of the catalog were really thin because everything was, there was like a paper shortage, and also it was very expensive to mail things, and so the lighter or the thinner the paper was, the more pages you could get into a letter. So the pages were really very thin, and but I would see things like a bedspread, which I of course we slept on these cots, uh, canvas cots that would you would fold them up during the daytime, and then set them back out, and then we would cover ourselves with the army blankets. Um, so so that's where I saw things that I never seen before. And actually, after we arrived in Denver, um, the train arrived at Union Station here in Denver, and I still remember when I got off the train. They were steam engines back then, and this huge gust of steam as I was stepping off the train um, at 4 years of age. The steam billowed up, and it really scared me. But and another thing that happened was, so we went to live in a hotel. There were, if you were Japanese and you lived in Colorado, you didn't have to go into the prison camps. So there were owners of hotels here in Denver, and so people passing through Denver. after we were let out of prison, would stay in these hotels until they could figure out where they were going, or try to find a job and move someplace else. And so it was the first time that I saw a bed being made, and I don't remember who it was, but they how you flip up the sheet in order to spread it out. I had never seen anything like it, and it frightened me because it was such a huge billowing piece of of white cloth, and I just didn't know what it was because I had never seen it in the 4 years that I was in prison.
And then you said your mother, they had to make your clothes, like your coat, because you couldn't get clothes. So you said they had to borrow the sewing machine. There was only one sewing machine
Right,
for the
right.
whole
So
camp.
there were 10,000 of us in the prison camp at Manzanar, and there were only 4 sewing machines. So my mother had to sign her name on a list to wait her turn to get the use of the sewing machine. So before she got her turn at the sewing machine, she would order patterns to make clothes, and also order cloth from through the Sarasota catalog, and then she would pin the patterns onto the cloth, and then cut out all of the uh, panels, and then so that she would be ready to sew as soon as she got the sewing machine, because she could keep it for only 48 hours. And she told me she would try to stay up for the entire 48 hours and sew, because she didn't know when she would have access to the sewing machine the next time. And I remember she put me in a basket by the side of the sewing machine. And remember there was no electricity, that she could, the sewing machines didn't run on electricity back then. It ran on a treadle, so there was a rubber loop around, these gears and things, and then you would pump it and make the needle go up and down. And so I remember the sound of the sewing machine, because she would put me in the basket by the side of the sewing machine while she was sewing. And just kind of a story about when we left, uh, when the camps closed and we were heading for Denver. Um, my mother, she knew that it was cold in Denver, so she ordered these 2 coats, a coat for me and my older sister, and they were. I don't know if you even know the color magenta. It's sort of a grape color, and I remember it had these bows on them. And my mother sewed me and my sister, identical. They're called pinafores, so that it has a skirt and then sort of straps that go over your shoulders. So we had matching dresses, and we caught a bus to Salt Lake City, and then and I remember we had to keep the shades down on the train, but I peeked out. I peeked under the shade, and I saw these different colors. They were like pink and green, and I didn't know what it was. And after I grew up and happened to visit Salt Lake City, I learned that those colors that I saw, and I didn't know what it was, came from the Great Salt Lake. And because of the salt content of the lake itself, it gives off these vapors, and those colors come from the vapors off of the lake. But anyway, on that train ride, it was very crowded, and there was um, hardly find a place to sit, much less sleep. I remember that my mother and my older sister and I went to the area on the train where there was a bathroom, and kind of a sitting area outside of the bathroom. And there were a couple of overstuffed chairs, and my mother pulled those chairs together, and she slept on those chairs. And my sister and I lay on the floor of the train and covered ourselves with a magenta colored coats that my mother had ordered for us from Sears Roebuck. And I remember, because my ear was on the floor of the train, I could hear the sound of the wheels going over the train tracks, and it's a sound that I can still remember.
Now, when you left Mount Zinar, and you came, why did you come to Denver, or how did you come to Denver?
We came to Denver because of my mother's situation. So we had lived in Los Angeles. That's where I was born. Um, and uh, my father had a produce market, which he lost. And he had just bought a half-ton pickup truck in order to go to the wholesalers to pick up fruits and vegetables to sell at his market. And he had to sell it for $50, which was, of course, way below, what he paid for it. And that was the situation with almost everybody. They lost money on everything because people knew that we were being forced to leave, and so you know they didn't have to actually pay anything. They could just wait until we left and then just take our stuff.
Just how you guys ended up in Denver.
Oh, so my mother was born in San Francisco and therefore a U.S. citizen. She was sent to Yokohama near Tokyo in Japan for her education, which was the case for a lot of immigrants and lots of people in those days. And so because she had the so-called rights of a U.S. citizen because she was born in San Francisco, but because she received her education in Japan, she went through high school and also something called finishing school in Japan. Um, the U.S. government said that she might be loyal to Japan because of the time she had spent there. So we couldn't go back to our home on the West Coast, and we had to move inland. And my father had a family friend who lived in Denver. He had started a small factory making soy sauce because at the outbreak of World War II, all of the imports from Japan stopped, so there was no more soy sauce from Japan. And so he decided to manufacture it here. My father got a job in that factory, and I grew up in that factory after we arrived in Denver in late 1945.
And you talk about your mother. You said like when you were in college, she did translating for you and she did some of the activism with you guys, you and your sister.
Right. So my mother was fairly unusual. She did talk about the camps, which a lot of the former inmates never did. They wanted to put it behind them, and kind of like men who go to war and they see and do things that they, don't want to remember. And but my mother did talk about it, and uh, she she also made a great effort to speak English without an accent, and she was fully bilingual. And so my younger sister, who was born in Denver, and I were political activists. And my mother joined in as well. This was in the, let me see, probably 1970s. Um, we joined a couple of national groups. One was called the Pacific Asian Coalition, and the other was called the Asian American um, Mental Health Research Center. and that was just because the grants that funded those programs came from the NIMH, then called NIMH, National Institute for Mental Health. Now it's just NIH. And it allowed us to organize across the country. My mother and I represented a region that included Denver and Colorado, and we traveled all over, organized on a national basis, uh, did things that even included doing studies on the Vietnamese boat people who came over at the end of the Vietnam War. But we also tried to look into mental health issues that had occurred because of our traumatic displacement during World War II. And in much the same way that the Central American children have been separated from their families and traumatized, that we suffered from traumas that are still today being discovered in a sense, because we had repressed those memories, and because, as they say, the history is told by the victor. So it's was a long time before we were able to investigate and write our own history from what we knew happened to us, and not from the lies that the U.S. government wanted to put forth in terms of why we were incarcerated.
And you say that this has been going on also with African Americans, with slavery, and also with like Mexican Americans, well, all foreigners coming in from other countries. This
Right. So
trauma, historical.
Right. That the killings of the 6 Asian women in Atlanta really brought it forward again. The centuries-long uh, descriptions of and beliefs about Asian women, and but it's that nothing is new in terms of that treatment of us, that it's happened to so many different ethnic groups, um, you know, from the indigenous who were forced off of their land, separated from their families, forced to cut their hair and stop speaking their language, and assimilate, uh, the separation of those children who were born into slavery, when their parents were sold off to a different plantation, the constant destruction of any businesses or communities that African Americans were able to pull together after slavery ended. And we know that there have been continuous efforts to keep people of color in their place. The voting impediments in Georgia is a clear example of that. The immigration patterns of those from the South, that, often pushed by climate change and problems in their home countries, by things like trading sanctions. For instance, the corn production in the U.S. is subsidized, and driving Mexican farmers out of business. And if you can't make a living there, you're forced to go somewhere else in order to send money back and support your families. And so it's, travesty upon travesty upon travesty. And the fact that today the right wingers seem to have no shame in terms of doing things like applying sanctions against voting by people of color, that they blatantly put forward those kinds of laws even today means that we've really made hardly any progress at all, and that we have to keep fighting for our place. And we shouldn't have to still be fighting in this day and age.
Can you talk about your experience or how your experience influenced your work today?
It's been a long struggle, and it hasn't ended. My radicalism has made me, I guess, what you would call a black sheep in the community, but it rarely deterred me from what I felt I needed to do in terms of trying to bring some justice into this country. And in a way, where I grew up in Five Points here in Denver, which is the ghetto of Denver, gave me lifelong friends. That I may have mentioned that Manual High School, we called ourselves the Little United Nations, and even today, I have friends from 50 years, 60 years ago, those who were in the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Party for self-defense. That there's a clear issue where the U.S. government destroyed an organization that was only trying to help its people. One of the things that I have tried to say to people along the way is that you always have to know what the enemy is doing so that you can try and circumvent it. So you need to learn their tactics, and so that you can avoid them or circumvent them. I've used those lifelong friendships to learn and lead me in the right direction, or what I consider the right direction, to keep fighting, to build alliances. One of the things that I think is really important is communication, and it's why I've co-produced a radio show, La Lucha Sigue, for more than 30 years. So my husband and I bring to the airwaves news on Latin America and the Caribbean that is not found in the mainstream press. We don't want people to forget about the United States continues to do. I traveled to Nicaragua back in the 1980s in order to speak with Nicaraguans, mostly women, about what the revolution in 1979 meant to them and how it had changed their lives. I've worked on the Navajo reservation, trying to make a difference in terms of the strip mining of coal by Peabody Corporation. Of course, there's the uranium mining that took place there. Oh, and right now I'm working with CIRC, the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, because legislation is another way to try and make a difference, try and change the laws. But communication, I think, is really the important thing. So to learn as much as you can, and then try to put into effect different policies that will actually make a difference. Of course, the right wing is always out there lurking and trying to subvert the kinds of laws that we put in place to make it easier to vote, to make things more equitable for equal pay, all of the things that are important to the real freedoms that all of us need in order to not only just to survive but to bloom.
I have a question from a student. They asked about your work on immigration and helping Japanese Americans gain citizenship status.
So my father emigrated to the United States back in the 1920s, the late 1920s. He could not even apply for U.S. citizenship until 1952, well after World War II ended. And there was a piece of legislation called the McCarran-Walter Act. And after that passed, he was able to apply for U.S. citizenship, and he did so as soon as he was able. And I went to his swearing-in ceremony, and he said that it was one of the happiest days of his life. Now, the Walter McCarran Act had some other bad provisions in it. I had an email exchange with Rudy Acuna, who pointed that out to me. So, when I was saying you need to constantly to learn, that's just an example of that. Gaining citizenship it's not all that it's cracked up to be. 2/3 of the 120,000 of us Japanese who were put into the concentration camps were U.S. citizens, and that didn't prevent our imprisonment, our loss of everything material and including up to and including our constitutional rights. So it does, however, afford some protections, or at least right now it does. Who knows what the right wing might be up to that would keep some of us from having all of the rights that we should have under the Constitution. So there's always work to be done. You need to outfox them.
Okay, and I think it's about time to start wrapping it up. So, is there anything else you would like to add? What's the radio station that you work on?
It's KGNU 88.5 FM. We have 2 studios, one in Boulder and one in Denver. We have 1390 AM in Denver.
Oh, okay.
And of course, you can get it online. So let me just say one last thing.
Oh, okay.
This is about the so-called reparations that the Japanese Americans were supposed to have received back in the 1980s. It was really a sham because there were some radical Asians, including me, participated in what was called a class action suit. So if you're an aggrieved group of people, you can file in court. But we were such neophytes, we were so new to the process that we filed in the wrong court, and we were turned back on a technicality. If we had had our day in court, we could have proven our losses, and we could have gotten for our community much more than the pittance of money that was given through the so-called governmental reparations. The U.S. government knew that we had filed this class action suit, so they rushed through a congressional approach, and it was worthless. They gave us a worthless presidential apology because the U.S. government has continued to do the very same kinds of things that they did to us, just to other populations. And with the African Americans who are now looking for compensation and reparations, I think they have to be very careful in terms of not being subverted by the government and agreeing to less and less and less, because that's what the government will do. But my main point that I wanted to make about the so-called reparations is that it was dividing tactic by the U.S. government to put Asians in general and Japanese in particular into this position in between them and so we're like this buffer between people of color and the ruling class. So they, what the U.S. government wanted to do was so that they could say, why can't you people, other people of color, pull yourselves up by the bootstraps like Japanese Americans did? And it's just another tactic by the U.S. government. They didn't mean it when they were sorry, because they've continued to use the very same process against others, and they wanted us to get as little as possible, but still get the benefits of being able to pat themselves on the back and to say that they did the right thing. So we, as people of color, have to be very careful about the motives of the U.S. government as we go forward in our struggle. And thanks very much for having me on this interview.